Live from Washington, I'm Ayesha Tanzeem, and you're watching Access Point. Hello and welcome. Afghans go to the polls tomorrow for a historic election. The country is gearing for its first democratic transfer of power. Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times correspondent Carlotta Gall has spent more time in Afghanistan than any other Western reporter. An attack on two journalists today in Afghanistan that killed one and injured the other reminds us just how dangerous this assignment was. She joins us in our New York studios today to talk about her new book, The Wrong Enemy. Carlotta, welcome to VOA and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you.
You argue in this book that Pakistan, not Afghanistan, is the real enemy. We've heard this narrative over and over again during the last few years. What does this book bring to the table?
I think it tries to tell the whole story and put it from the beginning to the end, because I started covering the war in Afghanistan in 2001 and right through for 10 years and then right up while I was writing the book until last year. And so I wanted to put everything in perspective, because you write things at the time, but they get lost in the general course of life. So when you put them together, you can make a much stronger argument that makes it clearer to the reader. So that was partly it. But of course, as I was working on the book, I did uncover more. And that's where I came to the final conclusion that Pakistan was actually protecting and hiding bin Laden, and that was the big bombshell, if you like, towards the end of the book.
We definitely want to come to that bombshell that created a lot of controversy. But I want to ask you something about the book first, because you make a very explosive allegation towards the final chapter that not only was Pakistan supporting proxies before, but even now Pakistan is supporting them. In fact, you write, Cassie Gannon of the Associated Press reported in September 2013 that Punjabi militants are massing in the tribal areas to join the Taliban and train ahead of an anticipated offensive into Afghanistan in 2014. Now, you know that Pakistan is trying to negotiate with the Taliban in that area, and if the negotiations fall through, the military is ready for an offensive. You think all this training is still going on while all that is happening?
Well, this is where you have to divide who's calling the shots in Pakistan and who's really doing what. So we have had in past times negotiations with the Pakistani Taliban, and we've had the Pakistani government or military offering to help America make deals with the Taliban in Afghanistan. So we've had some of this before. At the same time, when you're reporting there, you cannot get away from this fact that Pakistan is also collaborating with the Taliban and using them to attack foreign forces in Afghanistan and the government in Afghanistan. And now, as we see, they're even attacking journalists. So it's a double game. And there's different reasons why they're doing it, but I think you can't deny it.
And you mentioned the double game. Let me read out something else that you write, and let's put it up on screen as well. You write, on one hand, they're supporting the Qatar negotiations, which is the peace talks. On the other hand, they're telling the Taliban to prepare their leadership and appoint their leaders for the period after 2014. This is, Carlotta, a very specific and a very serious allegation. Why do you believe this?
Because that comment comes from the police chief of Kandahar, General Abdul Razik, who's a long-time security official from the south of Afghanistan, who's from Spin Boldak, which is right on the border with Pakistan. He knows a great deal about what's going on, and he knows the Taliban. And so I really do trust his judgment, because I've repeatedly interviewed him, and over the years the comments and the information he's given me and he's told others has proved correct. So one has to believe him, I think.
A lot of Pakistani officials that we've talked to, and several American officials that I've personally talked to, say that this is part of the old narrative, that yes, the Pakistanis were supporting proxies at one time, but they're trying to move away from that now. And one of the reasons they give is that because the facts on the ground have changed, that the Taliban have become a bad enough menace for Pakistan that they need to. You don't believe that?
Well, I believe that, and I think American officials believe that, and they tell the Pakistanis that in all of their conversations. And some Pakistani officials will tell you that also. But when you look at the facts of what's happening on the ground, and when you interview Taliban, when you interview security officials, when you interview Pakistanis, journalists who are terrified to print it, but they know things that they can't print, and they tell you this sort of thing, and then you get some insider detail because some people are seriously worried about what's happening in Pakistan. You start to see that there's another picture, and I really do believe that Pakistan's military is still running a campaign which is counterproductive even to Pakistan. But I believe it's happening, yes.
But do you think it's a campaign that's top-down? Could it be divisions within the ISI? They could be the old guard and the new guard. One of the things we see is the violence inside Pakistan, which include attacks on the military's own headquarters and their naval bases.
Right. I think what I found covering those, and I was often in Pakistan and reporting those on the ground, those sort of attacks. I frequently went to the scene myself. So I realized, Pakistani soldiers and intelligence officials and civilians are suffering in this and are fighting this. But I do believe that they're actually also operating. And this is because I've had people I trust who've told me we're doing a bit of both. There's a very senior intelligence official who told me we are cooperating with some militant groups, and we're also trying to capture some of them. So it's what it is it's the good Taliban and the bad Taliban. The Taliban who do the wishes of the Pakistani military, who cooperate and undertake operations that are suitable for Pakistan, are considered good Taliban, cooperative Taliban. And then there are others who are doing these attacks against their own mentors, if you like, their old handlers. And often that's in revenge, often that's just a show of force to get leverage. And often it's just plain mindless violence.
And do you think if the Pakistani military actually has an operation in North Waziristan, as they're talking about, that's going to change the situation?
Of course, that would, if it happened. We've been waiting for that for many years. There's been many years, even when President Musharraf was in power, we would hear there's an imminent operation in North Waziristan or South Waziristan. We're still waiting for really a broad Pakistani effort to clear the sanctuary that is in North Waziristan of foreign fighters and Pakistani Taliban who are cooperating together. And that, I think, is critical, but we haven't seen it happen yet. We're waiting, and I know the Sharif government of Nawaz Sharif is talking about it, and I'm watching daily to see what happens. But you become, after reporting from Pakistan for over a decade, you become skeptical, and you wait until you see things on the ground, because a lot of the speeches don't count for much.
Okay, the bombshell that you talked about in the beginning and the excerpt that was published in the New York Times 2 weeks ago raised a lot of ruckus in the press. You must have seen it. I want to read something that you read, the controversy. You allege that the former ISI chief, not just the agency, the chief, General Ahmed Shujaa Pasha, knew about bin Laden's whereabouts. So you write, a Pakistani official told me that the United States had direct evidence that the ISI chief, Lieutenant General Ahmed Shujaa Pasha, knew of bin Laden's presence in Abbottabad. The information came from a senior United States official, and I guess that the Americans had intercepted a phone call of Pasha's or one about him in the days after the raid. You've probably read the press in response to those excerpts. A lot of people are saying the evidence for this particular claim is not strong. Why do you believe this?
I believe it because I believe the source. I trust the source. And that when you're a journalist, you work with sources over the years, and you know them for many years. So they tell you things, you discuss many things, you often receive some stuff on the record, but a lot of it off the record. And many times you don't use it, but you watch and you learn that source, that what they told me about that has now proved true, or you check it out and you find other sources to corroborate it. So over the years, you come to learn who's telling you fibs and who's not. And this particular source I knew very well and I entirely trusted. And I then checked it with American sources and I said, should I run this? Is this absurd? And you get told by people you trust, you should believe that.
But you say in the book that your Times colleagues were not able to confirm it from the American side. They couldn't find even the name of the American source that the information was generated from. So you still think you...
Right, well, no, what happened, I think, was I passed it to Washington, which is how we work. I was in Pakistan. So they then try it against officials in the States, and they weren't able to confirm it. Yeah, and then we did find, this was in the weeks after the raid, that the American officials started to say there's no smoking gun, there's no proof that high-level officials knew that bin Laden was there. However, they also said, if you look closely, they would say someone knew, someone in Pakistan knew. So there was a bit of a cover-up we started to feel. And to this day, I think, the Americans have decided to stop talking about this, stop revealing anything they know. We've had very little of the huge haul of information that was taken out of bin Laden's house. Mm-hmm. All the computer files, the notebooks, the flash drives and so on. We've seen hardly any of it. So that's been a policy, I think, to try and repair the relationship.
Okay, so I reached out to Ambassador Kamran Munter, who used to be the U.S. ambassador in Pakistan at the time, and he said, particularly based on that intelligence that you mentioned, that he saw no evidence that somebody in the ISI, and particularly that Pasha, knew. In fact, he said he saw a lot of things that indicated otherwise. Let me also share with you what Peter Bergen wrote in response to those excerpts. And, he's the author of Manhunt, The Search for bin Laden, and he interviewed a lot of people, including some of the top people, Hillary Clinton, Admiral Mike Mullen, Leon Panetta, John Brennan, etc. He writes, I am convinced that there's no evidence that anyone in the Pakistani government, military, or intelligence agencies knowingly sheltered bin Laden. Do you think your source might have been off this one time?
It's possible, but I don't think so, because I've lived in Pakistan for most of the last 10 years, and Peter's lived in the States. So you get a different viewpoint. If you talk to American officials, you will get what they want to tell. And what's clear is that there is a divergence even within the American administration, between people who want to expose Pakistan more and people who want to keep the relationship going and actually suppress things. But there's also something different with, I know Ambassador Kamran Munter, and I would go to would meet with him and go to his press conferences. And I have to say, he was only there for 2 years in Pakistan. He didn't, I think, get under the skin of the Pakistanis. And you often notice this with reporters and diplomats. At first, the first couple of years they arrive in Pakistan, and I'm sure I was guilty of this too, they believe everything on face value. Pakistani officials are very credible and plausible. And then after living there and working there and seeing the discrepancy between what they say and what is actually happening on the ground, you start to realize that there's a deeper truth. And by the 3rd year, most journalists get it. And I think diplomats are the same. And I just think Kamran Munter didn't get it yet.
Okay, let me move on to, we can talk about it further, but let me move on to Afghanistan, because there's one incident that you describe in your book that I feel is so indicative of how the U.S. is fighting this war. On one hand, there are people who are trying to strong-arm their way through everything, and on the other hand are those who are trying to do the right thing. So you're talking about detentions and torture, and you talk about a taxi driver, an innocent taxi driver that's detained in Bagram, and he's tortured and killed. And they give him back the body, but they also give him back a death certificate that actually lists the cause of death as homicide. And you write in the book, you gasped as you read that. Tell me how you felt.
I remember being very surprised and shocked because I wasn't expecting it. I actually went to see the family. I was intrigued. I knew two men had died in Bagram within 1 week in custody. So, of course, one had questions. But we'd been told it was natural causes. But I wanted to meet the families and try and find out about the men to understand why people were still fighting the Americans. This was at a time when Afghanistan was mostly at peace, and most Afghans had welcomed the overthrow of the Taliban and the arrival of Western support because they were expecting, you know, peace and prosperity and development and so on. And yet people were still getting arrested and still running into trouble. And I wanted, anyway, so I went to find the family, and that's when they produced this death certificate. And I remember just being appalled that, and I said, oh my God, they killed him, to my translator who was with me. And that was very shocking because, you know, you didn't expect that to be happening in Bagram at that time. And that's when we uncovered more stories, and we found witnesses who'd survived and got out, and who told us some hair-raising stories of the treatment in Bagram.
What I find shocking is that he was murdered, but also shocking that he was given in writing by the US military that he's murdered. And I'm thinking to myself, this is Edward Snowden and WikiLeaks and Abu Ghraib all over again. There are those who are torturing, but then there are those who are saying, we will write the truth on this medical certificate and we will hand it out. Did you see this happen often in Afghanistan?
No, that was a pretty rare occasion. And in fact, of course, they did do an investigation into what the treatment in Bagram, and they cleaned it up. And I don't think we've ever had, well, we haven't had anyone die since in Bagram from the mistreatment by American soldiers. So that was an unusual case. Sometimes, but I think the military works like the military. They follow the rules, and so they handed over a death certificate with the family. And I think perhaps they didn't quite think that I would go off into the, you know, far villages of Host province and find it. So they were just doing what they would do, you know, in any case of any death.
Was there any follow-up by the family once they realized what was on that death certificate?
No, what's overwhelming is in Afghanistan is the dignity of the people and their attitude to death and to a horrible death like this at the hands of a foreign military. The father of Dilawar, who I visited many times and I've kept in touch with to this day, he told all the brothers and the whole family, we will not take revenge, which is something that's very natural to Afghans. And, you know, God will see that justice is done. So he very wisely, I think, sought to move on and to not try and join the Taliban or run away and fight or do anything against the Americans. He accepted it as God's law, and I don't think he ever forgave, but I think he sought a peaceful resolution to things.
There's another hair-raising incident in your book when a translator or interpreter goes on a night raid with a special operations team. Describe to us what he told you, and you write in the book that this is something he was even afraid to tell his own family.
Yeah. He was a young guy in his 20s, and he worked with the American military. A lot of young men do this to get some money, and so he was a translator, and he was working, I think, quite well with a team of ordinary soldiers in a base, but then he was asked to go with the special forces or special operations forces team on a night raid, and which he rarely did. It was an unusual request, but he went with them. And yeah, he saw them go to a village, and it's all silent. You follow in single file. It's all hand signals, and they burst into a room. I think that the unit fanned out in the village, but he followed one group, and they burst into a room, and he heard and he saw a young couple jump up from their mattress on the floor. And the boy said, you know, why? And they shot them, both. And they were very young, clearly a young married couple. And then in the next room, He actually didn't dare go in, but again, he saw the people. He saw 3 young children or teenagers and an old woman who did, again, stand up and say something, and he didn't see who they shot, but the soldiers fired shots. So very grim eyewitness testimony of the killing of civilians in a night raid, which we often heard from Afghan civilians complaining about these cases. They were often very difficult to report on because they often happened in areas that were terribly difficult to travel to and dangerous for us as journalists because of the Taliban presence. But this was an eyewitness account of someone who I know very well, so I really felt that it had to be included in the book.
Well, why do you think, what is your sense, why was it happening? Why were these American teams that were sent there with a particular mission doing this?
Well, they actually were doing a very important part of the surge, which was an influx of extra troops from America in 2009, 2010 to try and push back the Taliban insurgency, because it had become so dangerous that it actually threatened the whole of the south of Afghanistan and Kandahar city. So the night raids was part of that, because they have now very good intelligence. They had they were tracking a lot of the Taliban insurgents, tracking their phones, so they knew about their movements. They would know when there was a cell in an area planning something, and so they were trying to preempt some devastating bombings and attacks. I think that's a legitimate part of war. If you're going to do a surge, you do all types of operations to ensure, you know, the success of your operation. What was unnerving was to hear that instead of, and when you talk to the American military, they often tell you, we want to capture people because they're much more valuable for the information they give. We can then break up an entire cell. We often capture someone, get information, and go out the same night to pick up more people. So, but actually, when you find an eyewitness account, it was different from what the officials are telling you. It was actually bursting into a room of children and women and shooting what was definitely civilians. So I thought that had to be exposed.
You describe what we read in the news as the wedding bomb. American jets bomb a wedding party and several people are killed. I was amazed at the level of detail. I felt like I was watching a movie in slow motion. How did you manage to get that kind of detail for that kind of an incident?
Well, what's amazing is, you know, you go to a village like that. This was early in the war. This was, I think, 2003. And although the people have just been bombed by American jets and NATO forces, you find that they'll tell you everything. And the whole village had been devastated. First, we went to the hospital in Kandahar, and we found people there who were recovering. And of course, their relatives were there. So we got much of the story from some of the wounded people in hospital, and there were girls and women and young men as well, and middle-aged men. And then we drove up to the village, which took another sort of day, and found more of the survivors and some of the people who had to clear up. And then, so I spent a good, almost a week doing that story, gathering the information from different people, and then we saw the governor and the police chief of the area, and obviously was talking to the Americans as well. So, but I found everybody's tale so unbelievable that I wanted to put it all together. So that's why I showed how every different person, whether it was the neighbor whose house got attacked, or the young girl who was up on the roof with her mother, or the men who were sitting drinking tea and only one survived by falling, throwing himself in a ditch. Every story was gripping, so I tried to show it as a whole picture of everyone, what happened. It was heartbreaking.
So in your book, you go into a great deal of detail about what was going on in Afghanistan that was going wrong. You talk about the tribal divisions. You talk about, in your words, the obscene level of corruption by the Karzai administration. You talk about President Karzai and his brother trying to accumulate power and trying to sideline the other tribes. And you also at one point say that U.S. not left, but changed focus towards Iraq, and while the job was still not done in Afghanistan. But still at the end, you single out Pakistan. Why?
Because it just filled every year of my life of reporting. And I think I try and show that early on I went to Quetta and found the Taliban who'd escaped the American intervention and were resting up and hiding in Quetta. And then I saw how they started to come back. I saw how it was mishandled. Their whole presence in Quetta, they should have been encouraged to return and handled well, and there should have been a reconciliation program for them to join back into life in Afghanistan. That was mishandled, and the Americans were running very much counterterrorism strategy for a long time, and that deterred more coming back. And then seeing how, and being warned by friends and people I interviewed that this was what was happening. This is dangerous. Pakistan is reintroducing them, regrouping the Taliban, and then later to learn of these meetings. You just, to plot it all the way through, when I sat down to write this book, this was just the theme that kept coming back at me, and I had to expose it. I had to write it as it was, because I think what happened to me in Quetta when I was reporting, when I got beaten up and all my files seized by the authorities, really showed me this is being suppressed. The Pakistani reporters can't write about it. They're being warned off this. Someone's got to write about it and put it out there. And so the Pakistani people and the American people really know what's happening.
And you end your book on a very negative note, and here we are on the eve of Afghan elections. Do you feel hope or do you feel fear?
Well, actually, I think my last chapter, which is called Springtime in Zangabad, is quite hopeful, because I do see that the people of Afghanistan are rejecting the Taliban and they want a prosperous, normal, democratic life. There's no doubt about it. And I was just in Kabul last week, or earlier this week, watching the run-up to the elections, and people are excited and motivated, and they're all talking about and discussing the election. And I think the change from President Karzai, who's obviously been in power for more than a decade, and now he's stepping down and will hand over because he's had his 2 terms. That's exciting for Afghans. So there's that positive level. But I do have great fear of what the Taliban will still try and do.
You mentioned a perfect storm of difficult transitions and miscalculation by NATO and the West towards the end of your book.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. A mistranslation?
Yeah, I said perfect storm of difficult transitions at the end.
Yes, no, that's true. Yeah, no, because now we've got these elections. They probably will go to a second round because none of the candidates are really strong. So then you'll have the final, the second round in late May, and the results in June. You'll have a transition of power right at the time of the biggest fighting season, because the fighting season is always in the summer in Afghanistan. So that's going to be very difficult, just as NATO forces are all pulling out. So I think we've already seen how dangerous the climate is now. We've had a lot of nasty attacks in Kabul. We've had this terrible attack today on Kathy Gannon, a famous veteran reporter who loves Afghanistan and is so knowledgeable, and her colleague Anya, who was killed. I mean, it's really going to be, I think, a tough year for all concerned.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times correspondent Carlotta Gall. Her new book, The Wrong Enemy, is a comprehensive account of the war in Afghanistan. And thank you for watching. Hopefully you'll send us your comments on our Facebook page or Twitter. We'll look forward to them. Goodbye and good night.